Hey learners, here we are. We're talking about the West today and some of the settlers that are moving west, why they're going, what they're doing, and kind of fill in some of the more gaps. We talked a little bit about Native Americans already, so now we're going to move on to talk about some of those other settler groups that are moving west and populating the West. So we'll go straight to the PowerPoint here. You can follow along. There'll be a couple stops in here where you're going to have an opportunity to answer a few things. So as we go through that, we'll take a little pause and you can kind of fill some things in on your notes and such. So let me get this going here. We're talking about the settling of the West. So where we want to start today is I want you to, in your notebook there, list 4 or 5 reasons of why people move. So whether it's where they move houses or move to different cities, move to different towns, what are 4 or 5 reasons that people choose to move? What motivates them to move? So we'll take a little pause here, write down 4 or 5 reasons, and we'll talk about it. Okay, what'd you come up with? We've got so many different reasons that people might move, anything from like jobs or employment. That's one of the reasons that I ended up in Sherman, is because I moved here because of work. Certainly, sometimes natural disasters or things like that cause people to move to new places. The opportunities that are there, maybe to be closer to family. Sometimes people move for those kinds of reasons. Oftentimes people will move just for the opportunity of like to own a bigger house or more land or something of that nature. There's probably several reasons there that you kind of came up with or that you wrote down that I didn't list, because there are so many. But people move or people migrate for all kinds of different reasons. And when we talk about moving west, we need to kind of rewind for a second here. Let's talk a little bit about what's happened so far. When settlers first came to and settled the colonies and came to America, they were very content and very happy. We've got our pilgrims there that are dancing around. They were very happy to stay on the East Coast. There was no reason to press into the West because there was so much unknown. They settled kind of there along the East and didn't have to worry. If you push west, you might have conflicts with the Indians, you have bears and other wildlife and whatever it might be that you have to deal with. So if you stayed in the East and you had everything that you needed there, you could settle there and there was no reason to go west. Well, the more and more people came, the more overcrowded it became in the East, and the more need or the more reason to start to move west. And then along came this guy as president. You may recognize him, or maybe you don't, but he's known from such things as, like, I don't know, the Declaration of Independence and other things like that, but this is Thomas Jefferson. And when Thomas Jefferson comes around and becomes president, he becomes well known for making one of the best bargain buys of all time, something we know as the Louisiana Purchase. Nearly doubles the size of the United States of America because France is in trouble. Napoleon's empire, so to speak, is on the decline. And so he's looking to unload a lot of land, a lot of territory. And Thomas Jefferson, being opportunistic, says, hey, well, we'll take that. Cents on the acre, we'll do it. And so he nearly doubles the size of America. And so now the West, or whatever we call the West, just got a lot bigger for America. So now there is more territory out there. There's more land, there's more space, there's more potential opportunity, there's more curiosity and all those kinds of things. And so we just don't know what's out there, though. So in come these guys. You'll remember them from, I don't know, you've heard of them before. This is Lewis and Clark, and those are the explorers that are sent out there to say, okay, there's the West. Well, what's really actually out there? And so you guys know the story. They'll go out there with their journals and they look at the plants and look at the animals and they meet Sacagawea and all that whole deal. And they find out what the West is. And they come back to Thomas Jefferson and they're like, here's the report. There's lots of nice plants and animals, but there's also some very hostile natives. There's also bears that will eat you and all kinds of other dangers. So when they come back, and yes, there's a lot of great things out there, but for the most part, their report is it's pretty dangerous out there. And so people, again, are content not to move west. But as population continues to grow in those cities and people yearn for more space and yearn for more opportunity and just try to get away, think of it, it's kind of like the same thing as Sherman High School. You reach a certain amount of people in one place and it's a little bit too much, okay? It's like walking through the halls of passing period before pandemics. It's way too crowded. And so what do? You need to create more space. And that's kind of what's happening with the building of the new school. We're opening up more space so that people can be a little bit more not so crowded and comfortable. So that's the idea with people moving west. Now there are lots of reasons at this point why people would go west. I want you to go back over, we're gonna take a pause here. I want you to go back over your list that you wrote earlier. And anything that you have on there, I want you to look at that real quick, and I want you to underline any of those reasons that you think were also a reason that Americans went west during that time. So any of those reasons that you wrote, if you think that that would have worked for why Americans went west in the latter part of the 19th century, I want you to underline that. So I'm going to take a pause and give you the opportunity to do that right now. Okay, probably a lot of those things that you chose or that you wrote down earlier, there were settlers that were moving west for those reasons. Among those reasons, and this probably qualifies as jobs, is mining. And the opportunity to hopefully get rich in the mining business. We have the gold rush. We have not just gold, but silver and other precious metals out there that people are going there to either work in the mines or hopefully to get rich quick kind of fortune out there. And so in droves, people sell everything they have and they kind of sell out to try to go find their riches in the West. So that brings a number of people west and begins to pop up into little settlements all over, dotting throughout the West. Obviously, also the promise of land and free or cheap. Keep in mind, nobody's out there yet except for Native Americans. And so you go west, what's to keep you from just kind of planting your flag there and saying, okay, we're going to live here now, and just squatting on that land? Not a whole heck of a lot. So there's free or cheap land that's available, and you can have land that belongs to you. You can have those wide open spaces, which so many Americans desired. To own your own land meant you had a little piece of life for yourself. You had kind of carved out your own little life for yourself. And so many people sought that space and that ownership of land that was available in the West. Also, we have a new and burgeoning industry in the late 1900s or 1800s, late 19th century, of ranching and cattle drives. And so we have this cowboy culture developing out of this ranching business of getting the Longhorns back east. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later in the PowerPoint here. And then also, and maybe this is not by choice, maybe this is kind of by force more than anything, but Indian relocation brings Native Americans west. Now they're not choosing to go west on their own. It's not like they're making that choice for themselves, but nevertheless, it is moving people west, and those people are beginning to settle the West in different ways and bringing population out into those areas. So whether by choice or not, it is still helping settle the West to some degree. Also, other reasons that people might leave the East is because they're being persecuted on religious basis, or maybe by whatever race or socioeconomic background they might have. They're escaping persecution, they're escaping oppression, so they're moving west to try to get away from some of that stuff. And just like this great American curiosity, this desire, because there's so much unknown. And so you want to know what's out there, and that curiosity drives a number of people west. And perhaps just this hope, this American dream, the fact that maybe if you go west, you can carve out a life for yourself, you can find opportunity and just make your own life for yourself. And I think that's what the American dream of the West promises. You don't know exactly what life will be like out there, but it'll be uniquely yours, and it'll be your American dream. So a lot of those reasons work as factors to motivate people to go west. Now, we can categorize any of these as being either push or pull factors. And here's the difference. A push factor is something that pushes you out of where you're currently living. It makes you want to leave, or it pushes you out of where you are. A pull factor is something that draws you to a new place. So something attractive about that new place that will draw you and or pull you to that new location. So you see the difference? A push factor kind of makes you want to leave where you are. A pull factor makes you want to go or pull you into somewhere else. So what do you think? We're going to take a pause here for each one of these. I want you to identify that either as a push factor or a pull factor. So go through each bullet and say, do you think that is a push or a pull factor? Okay, here we go. Okay, so let's take a look. Gold rush or mining. Sounds like a great opportunity. Sounds like an opportunity to get rich. That is definitely a pull factor. That's going to lure them in. It's like that hope of gold, that hope of opportunity. Free or cheap land kind of works the same way. This opportunity to own your own land, that's going to draw you west because you want that free land. Even something like jobs, like ranching or the cattle drives, opportunity to work. Again, a job opportunity is going to be a pull factor, and it's going to draw you west because of that. Indian relocation, that's the forcible removal of Indians. They're getting pushed out of where they are, so that's definitely going to be a push factor. And in a very similar way, or religious or social persecution is making you want to leave where you're at. That's again going to be a push factor. The curiosity or the uniqueness of what it might be west, and the American dream, the hope of opportunity, that's both of those are going to be factors. So can you see the difference between when we're talking about migration, what a push factor is, something that makes you want to leave, and a pull factor is going to be something that draws you in? That's kind of what we're looking at with some of these reasons for moving west. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of these. Mining is a big one. Mining provides quite a bit of opportunity for fortune seekers and for people that are looking for jobs alike. It's obviously spurred on by the gold rush in California, but there are so many other places. And it's not just gold, it's silver and other precious metals that are available there. So it spurs all of these kinds of mine towns, or boom towns as we call them, popping up throughout the West as potential workers flood and fortune seekers flood to these areas. You end up with places that pop up, places like the Black Hills or Carson City or Leadville, become mining towns where hundreds, if not in some cases thousands of people flood to there, because if you've got miners that work in there, you need restaurants and saloons and hotels and general stores and doctors, and all of those jobs that come with it lead to much larger towns and larger settlements that build up right around those mining communities. There are a couple different ways that fortune seekers will mine, and different minings. Of course, the big mining shaft ones, the ones that go down into the earth, we know is quartz mining, and that's kind of the more industrial type of mining that goes on. But sluice box mining is kind of what a lot of your gold panners do and things like that, and I'll show you that in a second. There's also kind of mining called hydraulic mining, which I'll show you in the next slide. And all these miners, they go out there and form up these boom towns, and they'll take all the ore or all the minerals out of the land, and then whenever the mines are exhausted, whenever there's nothing else to be found, these boom towns are no longer booming. A lot of times they'll leave these towns, they'll move on to another place, and those boom towns become known as ghost towns. They literally, people just leave town, leave the structures up, leave the buildings up, they just kind of leave them and they become an empty ghost town. So when we're talking about mining, what does this look like for some? Well, if you're one of those sluice box miners, one of those fortune seekers, these guys, these guys are like miners all the way. These are our prospector kind of miners. A sluice box diverts part of the river or part of the water source, and it runs it through one of these troughs. And inside these troughs are kind of like little gridded plates or trays. And so all the sand and all the sediment from the river kind of washing down through there, it gets caught in these trays and kind of sifts out there. And hopefully what is left on top are those gold flakes or those gold nuggets. So it kind of diverts the river and does some of the work for you in panning. A kind of smaller, more portable version of the sluice box is this painting or etching of an old prospector there. He's pouring that water through and just kind of panning it through for gold through that little sluice box. The other kind of more industrial kind of method is hydraulic mining, which is basically like taking gigantic fire hoses and blasting away the sediment on the side of a mountain or the side of the earth, hoping that you're going to wear away or erode away enough that it's going to start to reveal some ore or some precious metals. This was very common because on the sides of mountains or on the sides of these land structures, there are oftentimes deposits of minerals, valuable minerals in there. So blast away all that dirt, blast away all that sediment, and hopefully reveal the good stuff, right? This is great for being efficient, but at the same time, if you're blasting gallons and gallons of water with fire hose across all that kind of stuff, you're going to destroy the ecosystem because you're going to flood different places and ruin, the whole natural flow of what's going on there, erode away soil. You're messing with nature when it goes with that. So they find eventually that's some really negative consequences, but that's one of the mining methods that they were using at the time. So for a big part of our westward movement, folks, they're miners and they're moving west. Another huge industry for us Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. This map kind of shows where some of those mining towns were. In your orange ones, those are kind of like, I believe those are your gold deposits or places where they were searching for gold. And the purple ones, I think, are silver, if I remember correctly. So these are, but the yellow states are all the ones that are affected by miners coming west. So it's not even just in these mine towns, but people settle in and around these places. And so all of these states or these territories at the time begin to see an influx of the population coming in because they're interested in what the land has to offer and the resources that are there. So another reason for people moving west is this booming cattle industry. And we think we know a lot about these cowboys of the West that work the land and or work the cattle drives and all that kind of deal. And there's nothing more American, right, than the cowboy. But it turns out maybe we don't always know as much as we think we do. So what I want you to do is we're going to do a little cowboy fact or fiction here. So it's going to go through each one of these little questions. And what I want you to determine is it fact or is it fiction? And all you have to say is true or false or fact or fiction. Did this actually happen the way that it said it would? Okay, so go through, read the statement, determine whether you think that's a cowboy fact or fiction, and then we'll come back to that. All right, so here's what we end up with. I'll go through them real quick, and you might be surprised by some of these, and that's because we don't always know as much as we think we do. So number one says, most of the cowboy clothing, food, terminology, and culture comes from Mexico. This is a fact, okay? Vaqueros are the ones that basically started the dress of the cowboy with the chaps and everything else like that. A lot of the terminology, you think of ranch comes from ranchero, bronco, a lot of those are rooted in Spanish. So a lot of what our current cowboy looks and sounds like comes from Mexico and from the vaqueros that were doing this prior to white settlers doing this. So yeah, that one is fact. Number two, after the roundup, cowboys would feed cattle as much as possible to fatten them up before taking them on the long drive. This makes a lot of sense, right? But it is fiction. This is not true. It is the exact opposite. They would starve the cattle. And you're thinking, why in the world would they starve the cattle? That doesn't make any sense. Well, when you take them on the long drive, you can't be driving them the whole time. And you're going to have to stop to sleep, stop to eat, do those kinds of things. When you stop, you don't want your cattle to run off. So the one way that you can guarantee that is you starve them for a couple months so that when you go and take them on the long drive, whenever you stop, the cattle will immediately be inclined to stop where they are, reach down towards the grass, and start eating. It makes them easier to keep together as a herd. It keeps them always occupied when you're sleeping or doing those other things. It keeps them from running off. Okay, so instead they would starve them. Number three says cattle were often lost at river crossings because they would get swept away by the current and float down the river. This is fact. A lot of times what would happen is they would get spooked, and you got the swift moving river, they get spooked or something, and they pick up their feet, and immediately what happens is these heavy tides, they take the cows can't swim, so they go sweeping on down the river, and there they go, milkshake, woo, okay? So that actually happened. That was a big danger for them on the long drive. Number four, cowboys carried guns primarily for protection from bandits and Indians. That's what you see on TV and all the time. That's what's in the movies, but this is actually fiction. The primary reason for carrying a weapon like that is to protect the herd, number one, from dangerous animals, and number two, if any of those cattle get sick, you gotta kill them right away. You do not want that disease spreading to the rest of the cattle, because keep in mind, the cowboy works, they're not his cattle. He works for somebody. He works for a rancher. He works for an owner of all this. And if he gets to the end of the long drive and puts those, is going to put all those cattle, all those longhorns on the end of it in a train car to send back east, and he doesn't get there with very many cattle, he's in trouble. So you need to try to keep the herd as healthy and safe as possible, because disease will spread like that. And so therefore, you keep that gun on hand just to kill that sick cattle off so they don't spread to everybody else, the rest of the cattle. Number five, cowboys worked very long days and typically 12 months out of the year. This one's kind of a trick question. This is fiction. They work very long days. That is definitely true, but they certainly don't want to work 12 months out of the year. The long drive takes about 3 months. You're not going to be driving cattle through northern Oklahoma in the snow in the middle of winter. So it's kind of a part-year job, and a lot of cowboys had to find other work for the rest of the year. Number six, the most common cause of stampedes was thunderstorms. This is fact. Cows get spooked by thunder and lightning, just like my 7-year-old son. So yeah, they would definitely stampede when that happens. So we don't know as much as we think we know about the Cowboys, and it's not exactly the story that they tell all the time in all of the movies and everything else like that. But basically, the reason it even happens is because of the high demand for beef in the East, particularly after the Civil War. There was a shortage. So what we've got all these longhorns in the West. If we can get them back east, get them on a train, ship them back east, slaughter them in the East, and you got beef, right? So that kind of is the whole idea. You've got all those longhorns out there, and you just need to get them to the end of the railroad spurs. The railroad wasn't as built up through the West anymore. So you've got them here in like northern Texas or where we are, but you got to get them to the railroad. And so that's what the long drive or there's all this cattle ranching in this era of the cowboy is all about, is getting them to that end of the railroad spur. So for a cowboy, it's kind of the way it works. Starts with the roundup in the spring. And roundup is just what it sounds like. You've got all this wide open range land, and their cattle just grazing around. So you round up this group of cattle. And then you got to look at their behinds, because their behind tells you whether you're allowed to sell them or not. What's on their behind? Well, it's that brand, because every owner brands their cattle. And so if they've got your brand on them, you can sell them. If not, you're going to have to let them loose and you can't take them to market. But if they've got your brand on it, they're good to sell. If they're not branded at all, they're a new calf or something like that, guess what you do? They get the hot poker, because they're not ready to sell this year, but you're going to brand them, and hopefully after a couple of years eating, they'll be good for you too, and you can go sell them. So they round them up, and like we talked about, they're going to starve them a little bit so that they don't go anywhere once the long drive starts. And then you set out on the long drive. Long drive, long days. You need to get to the end of that railroad spur as quickly as you can. Less chance of losing cattle along the way the quicker you do it. 10 to 14-hour days, 3 months long. It's a pretty tedious 3 months, however. We already mentioned some of the challenges that you'd run out there on the long drive. Anything from storms to sick cattle to river crossings. You don't have, it's not really all that, you don't have like lots of Native Americans that are coming, and you don't have lots of bandits and cattle rustlers. It's not like that, like you were led to believe. These are kind of your big problems that you might run into out there on the open range. So this works for quite some time, and this is the cowboy era. This is the cattle drive. This is all the things that they hear about and they talk about and everything else like that. But it doesn't last that long. The era of the cowboy, you would have thought that the American West, that there were cowboys forever, but really it's only about 15 or 20 years, because a couple things happen. Number one, all that land from all the cattle traveling across it becomes overgrazed. There's not hardly anything for them to eat in many of those areas. So the land becomes overgrazed and can't produce what it needs to for those cattle to be able to eat. And so it just doesn't work that anymore. Obviously, you also have some patterns of severe weather. You guys know that because you live here. But you get some patterns of severe weather that kind of disrupt the long drive a number of years in a row. It gets quite a bit colder than they had expected, and that sort of turns the season a little bit and makes it so that they can't do the long drive for several years in a row. And then finally, this big, vast area where all these cattle have been roaming is ruined by the invention of the cheap and very efficient barbed wire. Barbed wire is a fast and cheap way to fence in large areas. And so now this vast open range that all these cattle are roaming in, that the government's like, well, we're just going to leave it open. Now we can privatize that land, and you can sell it off by the chunk. And you can do it really easily because you can put up those fences quickly and easy and section it off and say, hey, buy this land from us, and here you can buy this land. You're going to monetize that land. And so in barbed wire, because of how cheap and easy and efficient it was, allows you to fence off that land. Well, once you fence off that land, you aren't having a long drive. You can't get cows to jump over the barbed wire fence. So the long drive kind of ends, and these cattle ranchers are able to kind of fence in their own groups, and it kind of privatizes the whole open range cowboy kind of deal. So it thus ends the era of the cowboy kind of a little unceremoniously because of barbed wire, overgrazed land, and several bad seasons, to be honest. So many people have argued it, and you could definitely say this. A famous historian in 1893 says, American history has been in a large degree the history of the colonization of the Great West. In other words, much of what we have, our American history, is kind of built on settling the West. It tells a lot about us. It's this idea where we go west and we make something of ourselves, and we take the wilderness and we tame it. And he says that kind of really tells the story of our history. And if you think about it, in some ways, there are a lot of images of the West that I think we could say are uniquely American. Think about it. What things that we associate, what pictures or ideas or images come to our mind that we think of as being the West, do you think are really kind of help define America? All right, take a minute and see if you can think of what about when we say the West, what images pop into your mind, and what of those images do you think we would say, oh yeah, that's definitely really American? Okay, take a moment to think about that. Okay, what things do you think of? I mean, obviously, immediately the cowboy and cattle rancher, right? What's more American than the cowboy, right? Dallas Cowboys, America's team, right? We just associate that with it. But even like these old American West saloon towns and boom towns, I think we think of as being very uniquely that American West. And there's the saloon culture, right? The saloon fight, gun down, showdowns, and all that kind of stuff. Even to the Indian culture in the West helps define a little bit of our American character, I think, and our Native Americans, and even maybe just that little house on the prairie kind of thing. I mean, this image, this picture kind of screams like that American West to me, and it's kind of iconic and sort of how we define ourselves a little bit. So that's another group of our settlers and move-ups. We didn't really talk about that last group, our homesteaders, our farmers, and we'll kind of get that in the next lesson. But so many reasons we've got those settlers moving west. Got a chance to zoom in on a little bit of those today and talk about why they are. Now what we're going to have you do, we're going to transition. We're going to move towards some vocabulary, some that we've already talked about in our Native American lesson for this lesson. I'll give you the opportunity, and how we're going to have you do it, we've got two different methods. If we're doing it here online, you've got the Google Slides that you're going to go through and edit to put in definitions and pictures for that vocabulary. Or if you're doing it in hard copy, we've got a kind of worksheet where you're going to write your own definitions and then kind of fill in little pictures or images that you think might associate with that term. So whichever way it is, we're going to go through that vocabulary and give you the chance to kind of work through some of that. Thanks for listening. And next time, we'll get a little bit more and kind of wrap up a little bit of the West. So if you have any questions, as always, don't forget you have the opportunity to reach out and just ask questions, and we'll kind of get you figured out. Alrighty, have a great day.